Thanks to one of our longtime viewers, I have a very special video for you all today. This is a 2023 Rivian R1S dual motor performance with over 12,500 miles on the odometer. Big shout out to Prakar for not only watching the channel on a regular basis, but liking us so much that he lent us this R1S for a weekend so we can run through exactly how things have gone for him over the last 12,500 miles. We'll take a look at the interior and the exterior, see how things have held up. Then we're going to take it for a drive, talk about how it compares to the quad motor version, why you definitely want to put the dual motor version on your shopping list. And I'm going to pause this video here for a moment because you may have noticed this is not the refreshed R1S. Rivian announced that shortly after we filmed this video. It has taken us a little bit of time to get this video assembled and together and out. But if you want to know more about the refreshed model, stay tuned for the end of the video. We're going to go over the changes for 2025 and 2025 pricing. If you want to see it driving, you can actually check out Travis's video. He was able to attend that launch event because I was busy doing something else, and he was able to drive the new R1S and R1T out on the road. But with that out of the way, let's get back into this R1S. If you're looking for a roomy and practical three-row EV, currently the two best options in the US are the EV9 and the Rivian R1S. Both have a big boxy practical cargo area in the back, both have a spacious third row, but aside from that, they're two quite different vehicles. The EV9 is much more on-road focused, this is much more off-road focused. It's also more luxury focused with a nicer quality interior, better quality components, real wood trim, etc. And you are going to pay more for the extra refinement, the adaptive air suspension, the incredible amount of power we find even in the dual motor models, etc. This starts at $74,900. That's basically where the Kia EV9 stops. The GT line trim will get a little bit more expensive than the base version of this, but no version is going to be as expensive as even this mid-level equipped dual motor performance. If you want the max pack, you can get that with the regular 533 horsepower dual motor setup. That's going to be $94,000, significantly more than the EV9, and it's no longer going to qualify for the federal tax credit. The dual motor performance model, it won't either, because it starts at $83,000. That's the one that's going to give you 315 miles of range. If you want the max pack and you want the dual motor performance, that's $99,000 starting. And interestingly enough, the dual motor performance version is going to be the most expensive way you can get your R1S because of that max pack. The battery is expensive, and that could get you up to over $108,000. The quad motor model, interestingly, starts at around $92,000. So if you just want to be just under $100,000, you have a lot of options and a lot of variation to choose from over here in the R1S. But the big things that are going to separate this from the Kia are going to be the off-road capability, the adaptive air suspension, the incredible levels of performance. There is no EV9 that will give you 835 horsepower. If, on the other hand, you're looking for something with slightly better on-road driving dynamics, you want more of a traditional setup as far as the dashboard displays and heads-up display options, CarPlay, things like that, then you want to take a look at the Kia EV9. In my opinion, the direct sales model at Rivian is a distinct advantage. However, keep in mind that direct sales are not allowed in every state in the US, so actually getting a Rivian in some places is a little bit more difficult, and servicing a Rivian is likely going to be a little bit tricky if you live outside of major metro areas, and there are a lot more Kia dealers and Kia service centers around the US. The EV9 will also give you a bit more of a traditional car experience inside, where we get Apple CarPlay, there's a heads-up display, and the way all the functions and features look and feel and behave is a bit more normative. Yes, there's an app. Yes, there is a key on this Rivian R1S, but I did notice that the key is a little bit slower to respond. So I hit the lock button. There we go, it finally locked. Things are a little bit quicker if you use a key in a Kia or a Cadillac or one of the other traditional car companies. The app does function quite well with the Rivian R1S, so if you prefer that particular model, know that you can do it on both sides, but this seems to be a little bit more targeted, a little bit more focused for the app model. With that out of the way, let's dive into this R1S and see how it's held up. First, let's talk about the design. I think this is still one of the more distinctive and attractive entries in this segment. I know not everybody is a fan of the light bar with these big LED lit rings around the headlights, but I have always been partial to that look. And I like the fact that the light bar changes colors depending on what's going on with the charging. So it's green if it's charging properly, red if there's an error, etc. That makes it a lot easier to tell what's going on in your driveway. Down there we also have recovery hooks because of course the R1S, like the R1T, is very off-road focused. We also have more of a long hood profile than we find in some of the competition, say something like a Kia EV9, and that's because under here we have a big frunk storage area. So let's just dive in there and see how that's held up. Power mechanism on the frunk, of course. It looks like the cargo area is held up pretty well. Looks like it's actually used fairly frequently. It's worth noting that Prakash puts a lot of miles on his vehicle. Not everybody is a fan of big front trunks, but I like the fact that you can store your charge cords, your adapters and things like that under there. And I like the fact that this is powered, although I wish it was a little bit lower because the load-in height is definitely a bit high. I like the fact that you can open it and close it with the remote control. That's really a nice touch. Now, moving around from there, the body work has held up pretty well. Obviously, it's not very old. He does have the paint protection film on it. Back here, we have one problem that I did notice, which was if I double-click the button to open the power hatch in the rear, sometimes it opens, sometimes it doesn't, and that I think is a bit of a bummer. That's a kind of a basic function. I am surprised that that has started to go a little bit wrong over the 12,000 miles. I also still think it's weird that we don't have a powered lower tailgate, although I do love the separate tailgate and hatch. The reason I wish this were powered is that, like on a Range Rover, you'd then be able to just hit the power button and have it all closed, but here it's just going to beep at you because you have to put this up manually first, then you can go up here, press that button right there, and then you'll be able to power close the hatch. Let's go ahead and take a look at the interior because this is where I was really interested to see how the materials and workmanship held up over time. And I have to say, I think Rivian has done an excellent job. You can see that we have the all-weather mats in this particular model, and when we take a look at the plastics and the materials on the doors and on the dashboard, everything has handled the wear and tear here really nicely. Again, lots and lots of miles on this vehicle. So this has the darker upholstery there. You can see that same distinctive Rivian seat design. Let's go in for an even closer look in here. Let's go ahead and say don't store some contacts there. Let's go take a look at the mileage. As you can see, 12,629 miles in just a few months. That's definitely a lot of miles. So anybody that thinks that EVs can't do a lot of miles a day and a lot of road trips, clearly they haven't seen one of these. I have to say, I like the software tweaks that have happened since we last drove the R1S. I really love this data panel on the side, actually, where we get our trip computer readouts so you can cycle between A and B. You can also get a little bit more information there on your trip computer readouts, tire pressures, motor temperatures, battery, elevation, etc. And this is a power and charge gauge. So if I put it in drive and start moving forward just a little bit here, you can see that it's delivering power to all four motors right there, and the regen happens just on the front motors. Interesting twist in this vehicle is actually, well, this is a good place to show you the camera setup there, but back to this screen. An interesting twist with this vehicle is that the regeneration happens on the front motor, and Rivian's motor strategy is to actually make this front-wheel drive for the most part. If extra traction is needed, it will turn on the rear electric motor, obviously for optimum performance. It's going to turn on the rear electric motor, but a lot of times it's just sitting there in front-wheel drive mode. The rest of the software, it's pretty similar to other Rivian models that we've tested. We have the on-screen navigation there with satellite views. We have our climate controls right over here, same touch controls that we've seen before. The wood here has definitely held up nicely. I know a lot of folks were concerned about these really abrupt bends in the wood and whether those would start having like sort of fractures or flaking or splinters or something like that over time. We don't see any of that in here. Dashboard is held up quite nicely as well. I love seeing how people use their vehicles in the real world. Prakash uses this area for things like the Kleenex box there, etc. And that's partially because we don't have a glove box in the R1T and R1S. I think that's one design oversight I would like to see them fix. Down here we have a common accessory for Rivian owners. This is a dual wireless charging location, and this one is MagSafe compliant, so it kind of centers your phone right on there. The regular charging mat, I noticed, is definitely difficult to just align your phone with, etc. So it seems like a lot of people are doing that. And then in here we have another common thing, which is a 3D printed tray, so that way you can separate your knickknacks from that area below. Looks like the second row gets a reasonable amount of use as well. One thing that I didn't notice when I first drove this vehicle is that because we have these hard-backed pockets to the front seats, if you're actually putting things in there, it means that the top just continues to stick out rather than the softer padded pockets where it would just sort of bulge out over whatever you've stuck in there. I love the fact that Rivian gives the seats a very consistent look. So the design of the seat back and the headrest, it's basically the same in the first row and in the second row, and back here in the third row as well. So even though the seat back is slightly different, it's a very similar theme, very similar headrest. It all looks very consistent with one another. Looks like he's also using his third row relatively often. And if we look up here on the ceiling, you can see that I am not the only one that thinks that these clear roof panels are just a little bit too bright, because he's actually tinted both of these sunroof panels. If you're really torn between the dual motor and the quad motor versions of the R1S, you should know that they don't feel worlds apart. Yes, the quad motor version is a little bit faster and it's going to handle just a little bit better. Around a corner like that, you'll notice that the quad motor kind of tracks the corner better because it can do torque vectoring across those motors. But 0 to 60 times, they're not that far apart. It's basically going to be about a half a second. In our last test, the quad motor version ran 0 to 60 just a hair over 2.9 seconds. This just a hair under 3.5, so 3.45 seconds 0 to 60. Both very, very quick times. But the nature of the vehicle is just a little bit different. I actually noticed a bit more torque steer in this model. If I slow down here and then romp on the throttle, you'll notice we do get a little bit more torque steer in the dual motor model than in the quad motor model. That just likely has to do with the amount of power that we get on the front axle and the fact that it's a traditional open differential up front. Now that's one thing I should mention. We don't have lockers available in the dual motor model. So the rear motor just has a regular open differential. It's going to rely on the brake-based torque vectoring system to send power from side to side. And that's not the case in the quad motor model. The quad motor definitely is going to have more wheel slip in the back until the system figures out what to do, but it doesn't have to rely on the brakes to send more power to one wheel than the other. It just dials the electric motor up or down. I would love to see what Rivian could do with a true locking differential, especially in the back, possibly in the front of the R1T and R1S. Not only would that mean that you wouldn't be using the brakes for brake-based torque vectoring, it would also mean the vehicle would probably tear up trails a little bit less. Because in the quad motor model in the back, you get the same sort of one-wheel scrabble that you get in the tri-motor Hummer before power is shuttled around to the other electric motor. And even though that's not really a durability problem for the vehicle, it means that off-road feel is a little bit different than you might be used to versus a vehicle with a traditional locker. And I suspect this could be a lot more traditional feeling if it had a locking front and a locking rear, even though there's no connection across the center. Now back to the rest of the numbers. In my 60 to 0 braking test, it took 129 feet for this to stop from 60 back to 0 versus 125 feet in the quad motor model. I suspect that tires are the reason for that. Also keep in mind these tires have over 12,000 miles on them now, and the ones on that other R1S, they were basically new. It didn't really have that many miles on it. I'm going to give handling an A+, but I will say that the quad motor model feels just a tiny bit more engaging because of the torque vectoring ability on the rear. I should talk about the motor strategy here with the R1S and R1T. If you get the dual motor model, not the quad motor model, then the front electric motors are the ones doing almost all the work under normal driving conditions. Driving down this road, even if I accelerate a little bit more, the front electric motors are either doing all the power or they're doing most of the power. But if you start getting into a situation where you're really winding this around your favorite winding mountain road, or if I put this in the sport mode, then things are a little bit different. Then power is a bit more evenly distributed front and rear, and sometimes it's going to have a rear power bias whenever it needs to for better handling. This power management and battery and motor management strategy is a little bit different than we find in the average EV out there, especially sporty EVs. Out on a rougher road like the gravel road that I'm on here, the R1S has kind of an unusual tune to the air suspension. It is not going to feel quite like the air suspension in a Grand Cherokee L or a Range Rover, possibly because of the curb weight of the R1S. Remember that the battery pack makes this relatively heavy, and if you get the biggest battery pack, that is going to be the heaviest version of the R1S available. The extra weight means that the suspension has to work a little bit harder to damp the motions of the vehicle. So some of the potholes and imperfections on the road, you'll feel a bit more in the cabin than you might expect, even though this has the adaptive air suspension. And the ride quality comes across as a little bit firmer also than something like a Range Rover. The size of the wheels and tires are also going to have an impact on ride quality, and this model is riding on 22-inch wheels and tires, and they are relatively low profile, so the tires themselves aren't soaking up quite as much as far as road imperfections go. Braking potential is greatest on the front axle. That's why performance vehicles have bigger brakes on the front than on the rear. Also, as far as vehicle dynamics and stability goes, you want to do your braking on the front axle. So if we're doing that anyway, you might as well have the front axle do the vehicle motivation when you're in single motor operation. But there's also something else going on here. Remember that Rivian is an adventure brand. They want you to take the R1S further off the beaten path than the average EV. And in a lot of those situations, having the majority of your power on the front axle makes a great deal of sense because it improves vehicle traction and vehicle stability both on-road and off-road. This is kind of a weird, head turnaround thing because so many dedicated off-road vehicles are rear-wheel drive in nature, but that does not have to do with where the power is best put for traction. That has simply to do with the fact that two-speed transfer cases and rear-wheel drive transmissions are the most robust designs that we have at the moment. But there are situations off-road where actually powering the front wheels versus the back wheels makes more sense. And because this has two electric motors, it can do whatever makes the most sense at the time. It's not constrained by those traditional drivetrain designs that you'd find in something like a Jeep Grand Cherokee, or a Land Rover, or a Range Rover, or a Ford Bronco, etc. This can send power wherever it's needed. And of course, if you get the quad motor model, it can send a huge amount of power to just a single wheel whenever it needs to. That's why the horsepower total on the quad motor model is so high, because they wanted to be able to deliver over 200 horsepower to a single wheel whenever it's needed. With that out of the way, let's roll through the rest of the numbers. Cabin noise in this model came in at 70 decibels. That's half a decibel louder than the last R1S that I tested, but keep in mind, different wheels, different tires, and these tires have 12,000 more miles on them. All of that is going to affect the cabin noise in a vehicle. Also, one thing to note is that I didn't notice as much motor whine in the cabin as you get in the quad motor model. It's pretty obvious in that quad motor when you're accelerating even moderately, but in the dual motor model, moderate acceleration doesn't elicit that same whine from the motor. So, for instance, if I wanted to pass this car in front of me, just moderate acceleration, no problem. If I floor it, then we do get that more pronounced motor whine into the cabin, but it's still more muted than we find in the quad motor model. I'm not entirely sure what the design considerations for the Enduro motors was, but I wouldn't be surprised if quieter operation was certainly high on the priority list. Now let's dive into efficiency. The last time I drove the R1S, I averaged 2.35 miles per kilowatt hour. That was obviously the quad motor model. In this dual motor model, its lifetime average so far has been 2.08 miles per kilowatt hour. So I'd say if you're looking for a holistic number, 2 miles per kilowatt hour is a great lifetime average to use. I haven't completed my fuel economy test loop in this model yet, so I'll just go ahead and post the result up there at the top of your screen, but I suspect it's actually going to be a little bit higher than 2.35 miles per kilowatt hour because the dual motor model is ever so slightly more fuel efficient. It is interesting to note, however, that the 835 horsepower version of the R1S really doesn't give up that much efficiency even versus the base 533 horsepower model. So Rivian has definitely done a lot to try and improve efficiency. But rather unusually, in the dual motor model, we don't have a conserve mode. The drive modes are going to be different based on the different version you get. If you get the base dual motor version, we don't get the sport mode, we don't get the sand mode. It's one of the off-road modes that we have in here, but we have the normal mode and we have the snow mode, of course. If you get the quad motor model, you get even more drive modes because that's the more off-road focused version. But weirdly, one of the drive modes you get in the quad motor that you don't get here is the conserve drive mode, which is the efficiency focused mode. I always thought that was a little bit unusual because I think that the efficiency mode in the dual motor model would kind of make sense because it could theoretically lock one of the motors out and then give you greater efficiency. But that's not what Rivian chose to do. Instead, Rivian chooses to just not use the rear electric motor when you're in steady state travel. So for instance, I was accelerating from that yield sign back there. It used the rear electric motor for a little bit at the very beginning, but then has already cut it out. And even if I accelerate a little bit more gently here, it's not going to use the rear electric motor. Power is just happening on the front axle. As promised, we now need to talk about what's changed for 2025. Of course, we get some updated styling on the outside, we get some feature changes here and there, but most importantly, we get updated mechanicals under the body as well. There's a new tri-motor version, there are new motors in the quad motor model, which has continued for 2025. Some folks were actually wondering if maybe the quad motor model would disappear, but it hasn't. And of course, we get updated range figures and some extra features as well. Let's talk about the lineup first, though.
These are the basic ways you can get the R1S. The first one is the 2-motor model with the standard battery pack. This is no longer an NMC battery, it's now an LFP battery. It's going to give you 270 miles of range, go 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds, produce 533 horsepower, 610 pound-feet of torque, and you can get that model for $75,900. Of course, plus destination, tax, title, license, etc. The key thing to know about this new base model battery pack is that it is an LFP pack, and that means that you can charge it to 100% on a regular basis. The NMC batteries that we find in the rest of the lineup, they recommend that you charge only to 80% unless you need the extra range on, some occasion here and there. You shouldn't be charging to 100% absolutely every day if you want to extend the life of the battery pack. That means, in reality, that you're going to find pretty similar range in the base battery in the R1S and the large battery, which has an EPA rating of 330 miles, if you're just charging that NMC pack to 80% and you, for instance, decided you want to go somewhere but the battery's not fully charged yet. However, on longer road trips, you're going to want the bigger battery because you're going to have longer range there. Now, if you do want that large pack, it's going to be more expensive, obviously, $82,900, same 0 to 60 time, same horsepower numbers. Then we get the max pack for 410 miles of range, $89,900, again, same 0 to 60, same horsepower number. But if you get the large or the max pack, you can add a performance upgrade that's going to go from 4.5 seconds 0 to 60 down to 3.4 seconds 0 to 60. That's a $5,000 option, but it bumps things up to 665 horsepower and a whopping 829 pound-feet of torque. That is a really, really swift 0 to 60 time for a 3-row family SUV. Of course, if you want to go faster, there's another option. That's the new tri-motor model that's going to get the max pack, 380 miles of range, so you are going to have to give up range for this, but it's going to go 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds thanks to 850 horsepower and, of course, a 6-figure price tag, $105,900. If you're patient and you wait for 2025, the calendar year 2025 that is, then you can get the new quad motor model, which uses the new in-house designed motors. That's going to rip 0 to 60 in 2.6 seconds. Really keeping this as one of the fastest ways you can go 0 to 60 in North America. That's thanks to an absolutely insane 1,025 horsepower, 1,198 pound-feet of torque. We don't have all the details on that model yet. Those are going to be announced a little bit later in 2024 or perhaps early 2025. And again, you're going to have to wait until calendar year 2025 if you want one of those. And that means that at the moment, if you want a quad motor R1S, you're going to be buying one of the available ones that's still in stock. There are a few left. If you want the quad motor model after that time period, you're going to want to wait till 2025. But honestly, I think the dual motor model and the tri-motor model are going to be where most shoppers will want to go. And that's part of why I borrowed the dual motor R1S. We see an update to the dual motor, but a lot of the advantages really are still here. So a lot of what I was talking about in this video, it applies directly to 2025. It's all about efficiency. You still get 3.4 seconds 0 to 60, which is still really, really quick, but you can get up to 410 miles of range. And as we've seen in the other Rivian models, the range figures are pretty accurate. Rivian has not been as aggressive, I would say, at really extending those range numbers like, say, Tesla has. Instead, they've chosen a more conservative approach. And we noticed that in our R1T as well. Even though it was a very early production model, it actually was able to match or exceed its EPA range numbers in real-world driving. Some other important changes for 2025, we now get an electrochromatic glass ceiling. And that's something I was really hoping for. We have it now. We don't have a full shade there, but it is really going to drop that solar load down, especially if you live in a hotter climate. It's not going to be as insulated as a fabric cover would be, but it's really going to be an improvement. And of course, if you don't want a glass roof, you're going to need to look elsewhere because we basically have glass roofs in the entire lineup. Then, of course, we get a quieter heat pump system. And actually, I should say new heat pump system that is quieter than the old air conditioning system because the previous R1T and R1S did not have a heat pump. So in cold weather, you will get improvements to the range and efficiency figures in the vehicle thanks to that heat pump. So let me know what you think about this, and what do you think about the competition? Clearly, this is a competitor to the Kia EV9, the Volvo EX90, the Tesla Model X, maybe something like a Mercedes-Benz GLS SUV, EQS SUV. But it's not exactly the same thing actually as any of these things, because it's a 3-row vehicle rather than an optional 3-row vehicle like we find in some of the competition. That definitely puts it in a different category than, say, Polestar 3 or Model X with that smaller 3rd row in the Model X. And it's also more off-road focused than any of these competitors. You can get an air suspension in something like, the Volvo EX90. That's going to be standard there, standard in Model X, standard in EQS. But none of them are going to give you this much ground clearance. We get gobs and gobs of ground clearance in the Rivian. We get more of an off-road focus, etc. In some ways, the EV9 maybe is a close parallel to the base version of the R1S. It's definitely less expensive, $54,900, and production has finally moved to Georgia. Later in this calendar year, 2024 or 2025, battery production is also going to move to the United States. And Kia has said that they believe it will qualify for the full $7,500 tax credit starting sometime around first quarter 2025. And that could make it a lot less expensive than many of the competitors that you might be considering in the 3-row segment. I was a little bit concerned about the price tag of the EV9. I think that direction really has solved some of those concerns. Of course, the EX90 from Volvo, I think, is probably going to be the closest competitor in reality because it's more of a luxury player. Size-wise, it's not quite as big as the R1S, but it's actually relatively close as far as the middle seats and the rear seats as well. It's also going to be similarly priced. It starts at around $77,000, so definitely in the same sort of price range as the R1S, and we get similar range figures, about 300 miles of range in the base model. It starts as a dual-motor EV with 402 horsepower. Performance is not going to be as aggressive in the Volvo lineup, because Volvo has, of course, been dialing back their performance aspirations. But it is going to have a torque-vectoring axle in the rear, and I'm really eager to see how that drives. If you want to know more about the EX90, stay tuned because I am going to be driving it over the next few weeks, so be sure and set your reminders down there in your notifications to actually let you know when that video is on the channel. And lastly, of course, we have the Tesla Model X. The egg-shaped profile definitely makes it less cargo practical and less 3rd row practical, but we also get less room in the 2nd row in the middle seat because of the gull-wing doors. That door design is definitely kind of cool. It's been a little bit problematic, but the bigger functional problem really is that it reduces headroom in the center because the hinges for the doors are there in the center seat position. Outboard seats have a lot of headroom. Inboard seat has notably less. Then, of course, you just have to decide whether you want the Rivian or you want the Tesla. Now, Rivian is going to have access to the Tesla Supercharger network, but 2025 is not bringing the NACS port or J3400 port native on the R1S and R1T yet. That's probably not going to come until the 2026 model year, solidly towards the end of the 2025 calendar year is when we expect to see those ports start cropping up on vehicles. So let me know what you think about all that down there. Are you interested in an R1S? I have to admit, I like the R1S an awful lot. If I were shopping for a 3-row family EV in the US today, this would be right there at the top of my list. I would choose the Kia EV9 if you want to spend a little bit less money. It's not going to be quite as nice inside, and it's not going to have the range that we find in the R1S. But if you want the ultimate EV, I would say, in this segment, it's absolutely going to be the R1S. It's the only one that's going to give you an honest-to-goodness 400 miles of EV range and have a really big 3rd row. Cargo capacity, I think that could be a little bit better, but it's still better than average. Let me know what you think about that. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. And of course, you can also leave us voice messages for content that's going to be included in upcoming podcasts and other episodes. So if you want to ask us questions, which car should I buy? What do you recommend for this or that? What do I think about Cord versus Camry or anything along those lines? You can email us. You can email us a voice memo, address up there, or you can also just drop us a voice message. You can call that number, record a message, and we will get it, and it'll actually be included in future episodes. So anyway, do all that, and I'll see all of you next week.